The bread was almost gone. Willa Sterling counted the remaining loaves with her eyes, pressing her gloved fingers beneath her apron to keep them from curling against the cold. The hearthside bakery had once smelled of rich yeast and warm honey, but this morning the air carried only the sharp metallic scent of winter frost. She pulled her hands from the warmth of the heavy fabric and picked up a stiff, bristled broom. The wooden floorboards were freezing beneath her boots, warped by years of spilled water and harsh seasons. Willa swept with deliberate, measured strokes. She was not cleaning for the sake of presentation. She was hunting. The pale dust of milled grain settled in the deep grooves of the oak, and she worked the broom carefully to extract every trace. Flour was no longer merely an ingredient in the northern borderlands. It was survival. She gathered a meager white mound near the base of the stone oven. It was barely enough to dust a kneading board, but she scooped it into a small wooden bowl anyway. The simple act of preserving it felt necessary. When the floor was clear, she set the broom against the stone wall. The draught biting through the window frame was relentless. Willa lifted her hands, inspecting the raw, red skin across her joints. She blew hot breath against her numb knuckles, rubbing them together before pressing them back into the deep pockets of her apron. Crying would not generate heat, and panic would not alter mathematics. She stepped behind the worn wooden counter and pulled open the small till. 3 copper coins rested in the bottom. She did not need to count them, but she touched them anyway. The metal was ice cold. 3 coppers. The flour tax levied by the local territory lord, Alpha Vance Cross, was strictly enforced. The new decree demanded 20 coppers from every working hearth. Willa stared at the meager sum. The deficit was a sheer, vertical wall of stone. She could not climb it. She could not bypass it. She let the knowledge settle into her like cold water into stone. Slow. Thorough. Filling every crack. There was no desperate gasping for air, no sudden weeping. The border towns had long ago side-eyed what an Omega's place should be. Her place, apparently, was at the very bottom of a corrupt ledger, waiting to be quietly erased. Willa looked at the deep stone cavity of her oven. The embers in the back were fading into a dull, ashen grey. Hardwood was strictly rationed, another decree signed by the Alpha's hand. If she let the fire die completely, it would take half a day and a bundle of dry kindling she did not possess to bring the temperature back up to a baking heat. She reached for an iron poker, turning the dying coals, nursing the fragile orange glow. Every movement was an exercise in conservation. Heat, flour, copper, breath. She managed them all with the grim efficiencies of a woman who had spent years balancing on the edge of ruin. The 3 coins mocked her from the drawer. The enforcers did not negotiate, nor did they accept partial payments. Willa pushed the drawer shut. The sharp click of the wood sliding into place echoed in the empty shop. The rough edge of the wood bit into her palms as she leaned her weight forward, steadying herself against the inevitable. The sound of the iron bell above the door shattered the quiet. Willa immediately straightened her spine, smoothing the front of her apron. The heavy oak door pushed inward, bringing a violent gust of snow and bitter wind into the bakery. Bramman Cole stepped over the threshold, pulling the door shut behind him with entirely too much force. He was the territory's tax clerk, a thin, narrow-shouldered man who wore the heavy wool coat of the administration, dyed in the dark green of the Alpha's household. The garment hung loose over his terrified frame. "Good morning, Brahman," Willa said. Her voice was level, betraying none of the cold calculation happening in her mind. The clerk did not meet her eyes. He shuffled toward the counter, his boot leaving wet, muddy tracks across the floorboards she had just swept. He stopped just short of the wooden display case, looking intently at the single row of day-old barley rolls resting behind the glass. "A roll, Willa. Just one of the dense ones. For the road," he mumbled, his voice carrying a strange, tight tremor. She reached into the case and wrapped the cold, dense bread in a square of rough parchment. As she placed it on the counter, she noticed his hands, The bakery was freezing, yet a bead of sweat tracked down the man's pale neck. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for a copper coin, and his thumbnail obsessively picked at a frayed thread on his official coat. It was not the cold making him shake. It was terror. Brahman slid the coin across the wood, bringing his face close to the glass. "He is moving the schedule up," he whispered into the draft. "Who is?" Willa asked, her hands folded over her apron. "Vance," Brahman hissed, his eyes darting toward the frosted front window. "He is not waiting for the week's end. He is conducting a personal audit of the lower border shops. Today." Willa felt the particular kind of pain that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation. The rumor had been circling the lower village for days, but hearing the clerk confirm it made it an unavoidable reality. Today, he is looking for an excuse to seize the corner lots, the nervous man continued. He picked at the loose thread on his sleeve again, pulling it so hard it snapped. If you do not have the 20 coppers by mid-afternoon, he will not just lock the doors. He will strip the deed. He wants the stone from these hearths for the new garrison wall. Willa looked at him. Brahman was complicit in the extortion. He held the ledger and wrote down the numbers. But he was also just a clerk, trying to offer a sliver of warning to a woman who had always spoken to him with quiet respect. "I have 3 coppers, Brahman," Willa said plainly. She refused to beg him for an extension he had no power to grant. The clerk squeezed his eyes shut for a fleeting moment. He took the wrapped roll, his knuckles white around the parchment. "Then you need to pack your things tonight," he whispered. "Do not be here when he arrives. If he finds you empty-handed, he will make an example of you." He did not wait for a reply. Brahman turned and hurried back out the door, throwing himself into the howling snowstorm. Willa stood perfectly still in the empty bakery. The bell tinkled weakly in the draught left behind by the closing door. Today, she had only a few hours to produce a miracle, or she would be cast out into the winter with nothing but the clothes on her back. She turned slowly toward the stone oven, watching the last orange ember pulse in the dark, and began to calculate her remaining firewood. The wind tearing across the Oakhaven border did not howl so much as it battered the architecture, throwing relentless sheets of ice against the bakery's thin wooden shutters. Inside, the temperature of the floorboards had steadily dropped since the grey dawn. Willa stood behind her empty counter, her breath forming faint white plumes in the dim, frost-edged room, when the iron bell above the door gave a violent, discordant rattle. The thick wooden portal shoved inward, forced open by the gale and the sheer weight of a man leaning heavily against the frame. He stumbled across the entryway, bringing a chaotic swirl of loose snow, dead leaves, and bitter northern cold with him. He did not look like a patron. He looked like the winter itself had chewed him up and spat him onto her swept floorboards. Willa did not scream, nor did she instinctively reach for the heavy iron fire poker resting by the hearth. Silence was a kind of armor, thinner than most, but lighter to carry. She merely held her rigid posture, her hands resting flat on the counter, reading the geometry of the intruder. He was tall, though his posture was sharply hunched, his broad shoulders curling inward, as if trying to preserve whatever fragile heat remained in his core. His clothes were little more than ragged layers of coarse wool and dirt-stained linen, stiff with frozen moisture. A heavy, frayed hood shadowed his features, but as he lifted his head to scan the room, the weak light from the frosted window caught the side of his face. Thick, jagged scars ran along his jawline and disappeared into the collar of his ruined coat. They were brutal marks, raised and pale against weather-beaten skin, the kind of wounds that usually spoke of violent pasts or feral animal encounters in the deep woods. Yet, it was not his scarred face that held Willa's analytical attention. It was his hands. The man had reached out to grip the edge of the flour-dusted counter to steady his wavering balance. His fingers were entirely exposed to the elements, lacking even the cheapest leather gloves. The skin across his knuckles was severely cracked, split open in deep, branching fissures lined with dried, blackened blood and fresh white frost. He was shivering, a deep structural tremor that rattled his entire frame, but he made absolutely no sound. He was completely mute, offering no plea for copper, no desperate demand for shelter. Willa knew exactly what that precise level of cold felt like. She had spent enough mornings breaking the thick ice over the village well, feeling the fragile skin of her palms threaten to split over the frozen hemp rope. She understood the mechanical reality of freezing to death. Stepping out from behind the counter, her worn boots made soft, deliberate sounds against the wood. Without uttering a single word, she walked to the heavy wooden chair tucked beneath her cutting table, gripped its high back, and dragged it across the floorboards. The wood scraped loudly, the sound stark and practical in the quiet room. She positioned the chair directly in front of the brick oven, where the massive stone still radiated a steady, residual warmth from the morning's baking. She stepped back, gesturing to the seat with an open hand, an invitation offered without conditions or questions. The stranger watched her for a long, unblinking moment. Then, with agonizing slowness, he dragged his frozen boots across the floor and lowered his large frame into the chair. He leaned forward, extending his bleeding hands toward the heated bricks, his chest hitching as the warmth finally met his damaged skin. Willa turned away to give him privacy in his physical relief. She moved to the small iron stove in the corner, where a blackened kettle sat over the dying embers. Lifting the heavy cast-iron lid, she tossed in a handful of dried pine needles she kept stored in a sealed glass jar. The sharp, resinous scent of the forest immediately bloomed in the damp air, cutting cleanly through the heavy, oppressive smell of wet wool and melting snow. She poured the boiling water into a chipped clay mug, wrapping her own cold fingers around the coarse ceramic to test the heat before setting it carefully on a wooden tray. Then, she looked at the cooling rack. Only one item remained in the entire bakery, the last loaf of barley bread. Its crust was dark, baked to a deep brown and dusted with coarse white flour, the center still holding a faint trace of oven warmth. It was the only food left in the building. It represented her dinner for tonight, and her only sustenance for the bitter morning to follow. She looked at the loaf, calculating the physical cost of her own hunger, weighing it against the silent, shivering figure huddled by her oven. The math of poverty was always simple, but the choice required a quiet kind of courage. Willa picked up the heavy loaf. She placed it beside the steaming mug of pine tea and carried the tray across the room, setting it quietly on the small stool beside his chair. The man's head snapped toward the tray. He stared at the barley bread as if it were an illusion conjured by the cold. Slowly, he reached into the deep frayed pocket of his coat. His trembling fingers searched the lining for a long moment before withdrawing something small. He placed his fist over the wooden stool and opened his cracked palm. A single rusted button dropped onto the wood with a dull, hollow clink. It was heavily corroded, the metal eaten away by green and brown decay, the edges crumbling into microscopic flakes of rust against the grain of the stool. It was entirely worthless. It could not buy a pinch of salt in Oakhaven, let alone a fresh loaf of bread and a hot drink. It was the absolute limit of his material wealth, offered in a desperate exchange for his survival. Willa looked at the crumbling metal, then up at the scarred face of the beggar. He was watching her intensely, his posture tightening, bracing for the inevitable rejection or the cruel mockery that usually accompanied such pathetic offerings in the ruthless borderlands. Instead, Willa reached out. She did not take the payment. With the side of her index finger, she gently pushed the rusted button back across the stool, sliding it toward his waiting hand. She gave a faint, definitive shake of her head, a quiet dismissal of the debt. She knew a rusted button was worthless. Instead, he reached out with his damaged hands and lifted the barley loaf with meticulous care. He broke it precisely in half. Then, he unwound the edge of his threadbare woolslen sleeve and carefully wrapped one half of the warm bread inside the fabric, tucking it close to his chest to preserve the heat and save it for later. It was the highly disciplined action of a man who knew how to stretch a single mercy across 1,000 miles of cold. When he finally lifted the clay mug to drink the hot pine tea, his eyes met hers over the rim. They were a startling, piercing grey. They did not hold the desperate, cloudy panic of a broken vagrant. They were sharp, analytical, and heavily anchored, taking the exact measure of the woman standing before him. He occupied the silence of the room not with submission, but with an immense, unspoken gratitude before quietly slipping back out into the howling blizzard. With the beggar gone, the air inside the bakery felt stark and empty, holding a sharp, biting stillness that settled deep into Willa's bones. She moved quickly in the dim light, her movements practiced and entirely silent. She layered her thin woolen skirts, wrapping a faded linen shawl tightly across her shoulders, determined to make one last desperate attempt at the market. The hearthside smelled of memories she could no longer afford to sustain. It was a faint, lingering scent of toasted barley, old yeast trapped in the grain of the floorboards, and the sweet resin of burning pine. Now, there was only the sharp chill of an unlit stone oven. The baker walked across the room, her breath plumbing in the freezing air, and stopped before the large wooden flour bin resting in the corner. She lifted the heavy lid. The iron hinges squeaked, a sound that seemed entirely too loud in the empty space. She looked down into the dark hollow of the barrel. Nothing remained but a fine, powdery coating clinging to the bottom edges. She did not cry. Years of enduring the border's harshness had taught her to lock away her grief, refusing to shed tears that no one would ever care to dry, and she certainly would not waste the moisture when she was entirely alone. Instead, she reached her hand down into the wooden container. Her cracked, flour-dusted fingers moved slowly across the rough grain of the wood. She pressed her thumb against the corner seam, gathering a small pinch of the white dust. The young woman lifted her hand and pressed the powder to her tongue. The taste was faint, but she recognized the quality instantly. It was a good, robust harvest, milled with care, carrying the slight nutty bitterness of the northern soil. This was her craft. This was the exact measure of her skill, the quiet labor that had kept her alive for years. Tasting it now was not an act of desperation, but a quiet confirmation of her own identity. She was a creator of sustenance, even when she had absolutely nothing left to bake. She closed the lid with a soft thud. The morning crowd would arrive in a few hours, workers and travelers seeking warmth and sustenance before heading out into the biting winter winds. She would have to face them standing behind empty shelves. Willa picked up a coarse linen rag and began to scrub the already spotless wooden counter. The physical rhythm of the labor gave her hands somewhere to go. She focused on the grain of the wood, the pressure of her palms, and the steady, measured drawing of her own breath. In a territory governed by extraction, maintaining a clean workspace was the only dignity no one could tax. By the time the grey light of midday finally seeped through the frosted windows, Willa pulled her heavy cloak tighter around her neck and stepped out into the village square. The snow crunched sharply beneath her boots, the ice holding firm under the bitter solstice sky. The market of Oakhaven was already beginning to stir, though the atmosphere was heavy, suffocated by an unspoken tension. Merchants moved with hunched shoulders, keeping their eyes fixed firmly on their own stalls, avoiding the gaze of anyone who walked past. She carried a woven basket over her arm. She needed grain, or at least enough firewood to keep the bakery from freezing entirely, and she had to ask for credit. She approached the first stall, a seller of milled oats. Before she could even speak a word, the man turned his back, aggressively rearranging a stack of burlap sacks. He did not look at her. The silence was not born of malice, but of a deeply ingrained survival instinct. Everyone in the pack knew that Alpha Vance kept meticulous, punishing ledgers. Associating with a woman who had defaulted on his exorbitant flour tax was a fast way to invite the enforcers to one's own door. The baker moved to the next stall. A woman selling dried root vegetables suddenly found her hands very busy, tying knots in a piece of twine, her jaw clenched tight. Willa did not press them. She understood the geometry of fear in this territory perfectly. She adjusted her grip on the basket and walked toward the edge of the market, where an old man stood behind a small pile of chopped timber. His name was Torris, and he had supplied her oven for 3 winters. She stopped in front of his cart, her posture straight. She asked him quietly for a 1/4 bundle of pine, offering to trade her mending services for the week. Torris scowled, his face hardening as he looked past her shoulder toward the center of the square, where 2 of the local enforcers were casually leaning against a stone well. "I don't run a charity for failing businesses," he snapped, his voice loud enough to carry across the freezing air. "Bring copper." Willa's breath hitched slightly at the sudden weight dragging her arm down. She looked at Torris. The old man was still scowling, waving her away with an angry flick of his wrist, but his dark eyes met hers for a split second. It was a sharp, focused look that commanded her to stay silent, to take the wood and survive the day. The village was not empty of compassion. It was simply paralyzed by the systemic tyranny of the local authority. The young woman bowed her head exactly the way a defeated Omega was expected to, accepting the harsh words, and turned to walk back through the snow, the heavy oak pressing a quiet, solid warmth against her side. Willa had barely returned from the market and set her woven basket down beside the extinguished hearth when the bakery's front door exploded inward. The violent force of the sudden kick snapped the rusted iron latch cleanly in 2. The jagged metal fragment skittered across the planks she had cleaned with such meticulous care only hours ago, coming to rest against the base of the counter. A brutal, howling gust of winter wind ripped through the small shop, carrying a blinding swirl of loose ice and the sharp, metallic scent of armed men. Alpha Vance Cross stepped over the threshold. He did not move with the quiet, devastating stillness of a true northern sovereign. He wore a heavy tailored coat of dyed green wool, lined with thick silver fox fur, the collar pulled high against the freezing draft. His pristine, oiled leather boots struck the floorboards with deliberate force. Behind him, 2 large enforcers filed into the narrow space, their iron-studded soles tracking thick, grey mud and dirty snow directly across the clean oak grain. Willa did not flinch. She placed her raw, cracked hands flat against the edge of the flour-dusted counter, rooting herself to the architecture of her own survival. 20 coppers, Willa, Vance said. His voice was a smooth, oily drawl that felt entirely out of place in the bitter, austere cold of the border town. He did not bother with a polite greeting or a formal declaration of pack business. He simply extended one thick, gloved hand, the stiff leather creaking slightly as he flexed his fingers toward her. The silence in the bakery tightened, pulled taut like a frozen hemp rope, nearing its breaking point. Willa looked at the wet mud, bleeding into the deep grooves of her floorboards, ruining the only dignity she had managed to maintain. "I do not have the tax, Vance," she answered. It was not a plea for mercy, nor was it an excuse. It was a flat, unyielding statement of mathematical reality. The local alpha smiled. It was a tight expression that did not reach his pale eyes. He lowered his extended hand and began a slow, deliberate walk across the length of the shop. He ran a gloved finger along the top edge of the empty glass display case, mocking the complete lack of inventory. He paused in front of the tall, slatted wooden cooling racks standing near the eastern stone wall. They were entirely bare, scrubbed clean of any residual yeast or flour, waiting for a harvest that was never going to come. Without breaking eye contact, Vance raised his heavy leather boot and drove his heel directly into the center support beam of the nearest rack. The dry, brittle wood splintered with a sharp, violent crack. The structure toppled sideways, crashing heavily into the adjacent shelf and sending a cascade of wooden dowels clattering across the floor. The noise echoed off the high stone walls before fading into a ringing silence. Splinters of aged pine settled over the muddy tracks left by his boots. He did not kick the furniture out of uncontrolled rage. He executed the movement with precise, petty, bureaucrat cruelty. He was waiting for her shoulders to drop, anticipating the inevitable panic and the desperate begging that always validated his authority over the starving border peasants. Willa gave him absolutely nothing. She kept her posture straight, her chin level, her breathing measured. The destruction of her property registered in her chest like a stone, dropping through still water, but she refused to let the ripple reach her face. Not because she was unafraid, but because she knew the exact currency of cruelty, and she would not pay him with her fear. She merely observed the broken wood, locking her jaw against the bitter draught. Vance stepped casually over the broken wooden beams, his silver fox collar shifting as he turned back toward the counter. He gestured vaguely toward the cold, unlit stone oven in the back of the room. "You have no grain. You have no copper. You are occupying a premium commercial lot on the main square and producing absolutely nothing for this territory," Vance declared, his voice carrying the practiced, bureaucratic cadence of an official pack magistrate. He snapped his fingers over his shoulder. One of the enforcers stepped forward, producing a rolled parchment sealed with a heavy glob of dark green wax. Vance took the document and slapped it flat against the wooden counter, pressing it right over the faint microscopic dusting of milled flour Willa had so carefully gathered that morning. The heavy thud vibrated up through the floorboards. "This bakery is forfeit," Vance said softly, leaning his weight against the wood. "The pack administration requires a new cold storage warehouse for the winter grain tithes. This building will serve that purpose. You have until nightfall to vacate the premises. If you are still standing in this room when the sun drops below the tree line, my men will remove you by force." Willa looked down at the heavy wax seal. The eviction notice was completely illegal under sovereign law. A territory lord could not seize a private, registered hearth without a formal council tribunal and documented compensation. But the border was far from the capital, and Vance functioned as his own judge, jury, and executioner. She did not reach for the paper. Instead, she lifted her gaze, meeting the corrupt Alpha's eyes with a severe stillness that made the enforcer behind him shift uncomfortably. "You cannot repurpose this building for cold storage," Willa said. Her voice was remarkably steady, completely devoid of the hysterical pleading Vance had anticipated. "The foundation is vented for high heat, not insulation. The winter damp will rot your stored grain from the bottom up. And you cannot claim the oven." Vance let out a short, dismissive laugh, leaning closer. "I am the territory lord. I claim whatever sits on my dirt." "The dirt belongs to the sovereign crown," Willa corrected him quietly, her tone carrying the absolute weight of the law. "And the stones in that oven were not laid by your pack labourers. They were cut, carried, and mortared by my grandfather 50 years ago. He built the draft chimney by hand. He registered this hearth under the old Royal Artisan Guild laws. You can throw me into the snow, Vance, but if you tear down a registered artisan hearth without a direct sovereign decree, you will be answering to the capital's auditors." The local Alpha's mocking smile vanished entirely. He hated her in that exact moment. He hated that she did not shrink from his physical presence, hated that she knew the obscure administrative laws of the trade guilds better than his own clerks. Most of all, he hated the quiet, unshakable dignity she maintained while wearing a frayed linen apron and freezing in her own shop. Vance slammed his gloved fist violently against the counter, rattling the heavy parchment. "The capital is a month's ride through frozen mountains," Vance snarled, leaning so close Willa could smell the stale, expensive wine lingering on his breath. "There are no sovereign auditors coming to save you, Willa. There is only me, and I am telling you that by dusk this oven belongs to the pack, and you belong to the winter." Willa held her ground. She did not lean away from his sudden, aggressive posturing. The space between them was charged with a heavy, suffocating pressure, the absolute weight of corrupt authority pressing down on a woman who had nothing left to lose but her self-respect. "Then I will pack my things," Willa said softly, her tone entirely neutral. She refused to give him the satisfaction of a physical confrontation she could not win, relying instead on the cold, hard endurance that had kept her alive this long. Vance sneered, stepping back from the counter, deeply satisfied that he had finally forced her compliance, completely unaware that her quiet submission was merely a tactical retreat. The wind outside the hearthside had sharpened into a high, feral howl, battering the fragile wooden walls until the frost on the window panes seemed to hum. The sudden clatter of the iron latch breaking the tension was loud enough to make the floorboards vibrate. A violent swirl of blinding white snow chased a hunched figure through the doorway, depositing a thick layer of fresh ice onto the worn entry stones. The scarred beggar from earlier slipped back inside, pulling his ragged, weather-beaten cloak tighter against the escalating blizzard. He moved quietly, pulling the solid timber entryway shut behind him with a slow, deliberate click, seeking the lingering warmth of the dead hearth. His timing, however, could not have been worse. Vance snapped his attention away from the empty display shelves, his lip curling upward in immediate, visceral disgust at the intrusion. The sudden drop in temperature seemed to irritate the corrupt local alpha far more than the obvious physical misery of the man who had just entered. Bramman Cole, clutching the heavy extortion ledger near the window, took a nervous, half-step backward as the snow blew in, wiping his wire-rimmed spectacles with a trembling, ink-stained hand. Vance stared at the beggar's snow-caked boots, the cracked leather binding his wrists, and the frayed edges of his hood, assessing him in a brief heartbeat and finding absolutely nothing of value. To the pack leader, authority was entirely visible. It was heavy wolf fur, polished silver clasps, and loud, aggressive demands. The silent, scarred man bleeding melted snow onto the floorboards possessed none of these things. "Is this what my territory has become?" Vance asked, his voice dripping with theatrical contempt as he gestured broadly toward the door. "A refuge for stray dogs and gutter wolves. We are standing in a building that now belongs to the pack, and this filth tracks winter mud across my property." He did not even bother to draw a weapon, nor did he raise his voice beyond a sharp, commanding bark. He merely snapped his gloved fingers toward the two heavy-set enforcers standing near the flour bins. "Throw him back out. If he wants to freeze, he can do it on the public road, not inside a royal tax asset." The enforcers stepped forward, their heavy boots thudding against the wood, expecting the immediate, frantic scrambling of a desperate man. They expected pleading. They expected a frantic retreat back into the lethal cold. Instead, the beggar did absolutely nothing. He did not raise his hands to defend himself, nor did he shrink back against the frozen wood of the door. He simply stood completely still. As the first enforcer reached out to grab the frayed collar of his cloak, the beggar slowly lifted his head, fixing his gaze on Vance. The stillness radiating from him was not the paralysis of fear. It was something entirely different, a profound, absolute calm that settled over the room like a heavy stone dropping into still water. There was no nervous shifting of weight, no erratic breathing, no wide-eyed panic. He occupied the space with the casual, terrifying gravity of a mountain, anchored to the floorboards by a quiet sovereignty that defied his ruined clothing. The enforcers hesitated, their hands hovering just inches from his shoulders, suddenly and inexplicably unwilling to close the distance. The beggar's eyes, shadowed beneath the hood, remained locked on the local alpha, unblinking and entirely devoid of submission. Willa watched the hesitation of the enforcers from her place behind the counter. She saw the minute shift in the beggar's posture, the way his broad shoulders leveled beneath the wet fabric of his cloak. The air in the bakery felt suddenly dense, the sharp smell of ozone mixing incongruously with the scent of stale flour and old ash. She looked at the rusted button, still resting on the wood where he had offered it earlier as payment for his bread. Knowing the scarred man possessed nothing, and assuming he would be beaten to death if the enforcers remembered their violent orders, she made a calculated choice to act. "He is only seeking shelter," Willa said, her voice steady, refusing to let the tremor in her hands translate to her spoken words. She stepped out from behind the safety of the heavy wooden counter, placing herself deliberately in the sightline between Vance and the silent man by the door. "He took nothing. I gave him the bread earlier. If you are taking the bakery for the tax, then take it, but leave him out of your ledgers." Vance's face darkened, the arrogant amusement vanishing into a tight mask of offended pride. The idea that a bankrupt, isolated baker would dare to issue terms to him in his newly acquired property was an insult he could not ignore. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides, his heavy boots echoing like drumbeats in the small room. "You do not dictate terms to me, little baker," Vance hissed, his jaw rigid. "You are nothing but a debtor, and you will learn the cost of defending the useless." He raised his gloved hand, pulling his arm back to deliver a brutal, backhanded strike meant to send her crashing into the empty grain bins. Willa did not scream. She had spent enough of her life learning not to cower in front of men who used violence as a substitute for respect. She locked her knees, bracing her spine, and prepared to take the physical impact without giving him the satisfaction of a plea. The strike never landed. The beggar moved. It was not a frantic rush or a desperate lunge, but a seamless, liquid shift of weight that crossed the room faster than human eyes could track. He stepped directly between Willa and the corrupt alpha, raising a single hand. He caught Vance's descending fist mid-air. The impact sounded like a heavy iron hammer striking an anvil. Vance's forward momentum halted instantly, his entire body jerking to a sudden, unnatural stop. For a fleeting instant, the local leader tried to push through the block, his muscles straining, his face contorting in an effort to crush the beggar's resistance. The thick, heavy silence of the bakery was broken by a sickening, distinct sound. The physical, tactile crunch of bone grinding against bone. It was a slow, methodical compression. No magical aura flared, no biological growl echoed through the room. There was only the raw, undeniable reality of absolute physical sovereignty applying pressure. Vance gasped, the color draining from his face as his knees buckled slightly under the sheer, immovable force anchoring his arm. The iron grip on Vance's wrist did not loosen. For a brief moment, the local alpha merely looked confused. His face twisted in a sneer of disbelief, baffled that a ragged vagrant had intercepted his strike. He yanked his arm, expecting the frail man to stumble forward, but the limb did not move. It was as if his wrist had been locked in a vice forged from solid iron. The beggar did not speak. He did not growl. He simply straightened his spine. The hunched posture that had occupied the corner of the bakery vanished in an instant, replaced by the stillness of a compass needle-finding north. He grew taller, his shoulders broadening beneath the ruined fabric. His physical presence expanded, until the cramped, flour-dusted space felt entirely consumed by him. Vance's sneer faltered, quickly replaced by a sudden, sharp intake of breath. The air in the room fundamentally changed. It did not merely drop in temperature, it grew incredibly heavy, pressing down on the lungs of everyone present with the suffocating weight of an ocean trench. The scent of dried yeast, old pine, and winter frost was instantly obliterated by the terrifying, ozone-sharp pressure of raw, unfiltered dominance. This was not the loud, performative aggression that local lords used to enforce their borders. It was a primal, architectural authority. Without a single word, the stranger twisted his grip. Vance let out a choked gasp. His knees buckled immediately under the sheer mechanical force applied to his joint. The beggar stepped forward, occupying the space the local alpha was forced to retreat from. With a single, unhurried motion, he threw his attacker backward. Vance crashed violently into the wooden display counter, his heavy boots sliding wildly against the floorboards before he collapsed in a heap of tangled wool and bruised ego. He scrambled backward against the grain bins, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a sudden animalistic terror that defied his inherited rank. Behind him, the three enforcers did not draw their weapons. They did not shout, nor did they rush forward to defend their fallen leader. Instead, a collective shudder ran through the men. Their wolf instincts, older and truer than any political allegiance, recognized a predatory aura vastly superior to the petty tyrant whining on the floor. One by one, the enforcers took a slow mechanical step backward. They lowered their chins toward their chests, exposing the backs of their necks in involuntary submission. Their eyes remained fixed on the uneven floorboards, unwilling to meet the gaze of the man standing in the center of the room. The silence that followed was absolute, thick enough to choke on. Not the kind of silence that falls between words. The kind that swallows them whole. Willa stood motionless behind the counter, her fingers gripping the edge of the wood, watching a vagrant dismantle a corrupt regime without throwing a single punch. The quiet was shattered by the thunderous rhythm of hooves striking the frozen earth outside. The sound cut through the howling winter wind, organized and relentless, halting directly in front of the bakery's frosted windows. Willa felt the heavy vibration deep in the soles of her boots. These were not the ragged, overworked beasts used by the local tax collectors. These were massive, iron-shod war mounts, bred for the harsh northern campaigns and trained to withstand the bitter cold. Before Vance could attempt to push himself off the floor, the massive front doors of the bakery were thrown violently open. The bitter wind rushed in, carrying with it a blinding cloud of crystallized snow, but it was the sight beyond the threshold that made the room freeze entirely. A contingent of heavily armored men stood in perfect, terrifying formation outside the shop. The steam rising from the flanks of their massive horses poured into the open doorway, creating a thick, silent fog that curled around the boots of the soldiers. At their lead was a tall, disciplined warrior, clad in deep indigo wool and brushed steel. It was a uniform Willa had only seen in old sketches, the official livery of the sovereign court. The armored man crossed the entrance. This was Captain Garrick Moss, a commander whose reputation for military precision and silent obedience preceded him across every border territory. He did not look at the corrupt official cowering near the spilled flour bins. He did not look at the trembling enforcers pressing their backs against the far wall. He did not even look at Willa standing behind the counter. Garrick walked directly into the middle of the shop, his heavy steel-toed boots echoing against the wood, and stopped precisely 3 paces from the scarred stranger. With a unified metallic clatter, the guards dropped to one knee. Willa's breath hitched, the realization lodging in her chest like a splinter of cold glass. The men outside, the rigid military discipline, the heavy fog rolling off the war horses, the sheer, undeniable authority kneeling before a man dressed in rags. It was a sequence of concrete evidence that left only one impossible conclusion. The enforcers whimpered, pressing themselves closer to the shadows. Vance remained on the floor, his face drained of all color, staring at the knelt guards as if he had just witnessed the sky tear open. The beggar remained perfectly still, the winter storm howling behind him. He accepted the royal salute not with surprise, but with the weary, measured familiarity of a sovereign returning to his throne. Turning his back to the blinding wind, the man who had been a hunched, silent beggar reached for the clasp at his throat. The rusted iron pin gave way with a sharp snap. He let the coarse, filth-stiffened wool slide from his shoulders. It hit the floorboards with a dull, heavy thud, sending up a faint white cloud of spilled flour. Beneath the rags, there was no starved peasant. There was only dark, immaculately tailored velvet, reinforced leather, and the hard, undeniable glint of cold iron. Alden Vaughan did not draw a weapon he did not need to. He simply stood to his full, terrifying height, his broad shoulders suddenly blocking the meager winter light that filtered through the frosted windows. Slowly, deliberately, he raised a large, scarred hand and brushed a smudge of white baking flour from his dark lapel. The movement was perfectly unhurried. It was the gesture of a man who possessed absolute control over the air in the room, over the pulse of every wolf present. Vance's cross remained frozen on the ground. The local alpha's face had drained of all color, leaving his skin the sickly pallor of old parchment. His previous arrogance had shattered completely, replaced by the instinctual, suffocating terror of a lesser wolf standing before the true apex of their kind. Alden lowered his hand and turned his wrist outward. Resting heavily against his thick leather glove was the royal crest. It was a massive silver ring, forged into the shape of the sovereign wolf of the northern realm, its intricate edges worn smooth by centuries of absolute law. The metal caught the dim grey light, throwing a harsh, silvery reflection against the flour-dusted walls of the small bakery. It was not merely a symbol of wealth. It was the ultimate legal authority of the pack, the physical manifestation of the High Court's jurisdiction. Vance stared at the silver wolf, his jaw trembling violently. He tried to speak, to form some kind of defense, a greeting or an apology, but his throat only produced a hollow choking sound. His sudden muteness was absolute, an existential dread that completely obliterated his ability to form language. Alden looked down at the trembling man with eyes as cold and grey as a frozen northern lake. He did not yell. He did not bare his teeth like a feral beast. He occupied the quiet space without apology, allowing the crushing weight of his true identity to press the corrupt lord further into the floorboards. The sovereign king had not come to the borderlands to fight in the mud. He'd come to audit the rot within his territory, to execute structural justice, and the trial had already concluded before the accused even realized he was in a courtroom. Willa remained completely motionless behind the wooden counter. She did not fall to her knees in blind worship. She did not gasp or cry out. Instead, she took one slow, measured step backward, then another until her hips pressed firmly against the edge of her familiar wooden prep table. She reached behind her, letting her cracked, flour-stained fingers grip the worn edge of the oak board, the tactile sensation of the wood, the grooves worn into it by years of her own relentless labor, grounded her. She needed the physical touch of her craft to anchor her spinning mind. The man standing in the center of her bakery was not a starving outcast. He was the ruler of the entire North. Willa stared at his broad back, at the silver crest gleaming on his glove, and let the quiet realization settle into her like cold water into stone. The hot pine tea she had poured for him, the last precious loaf of warm barley bread she had pressed into his scarred hands. She had given away the very last of her survival resources, believing she was comforting a man who possessed even less than she did. Instead, she had been feeding the wealthiest, most powerful sovereign in the territory. He had sat in the corner of her freezing shop, wrapped in false poverty, quietly evaluating her, testing her heart while she starved. A strange, cold clarity washed over her. She watched Vance whimpering on the floor. The beggar had not needed her bread to survive the winter storm. He had needed it to measure the moral decay of his borderlands. Her quiet act of charity had been weighed, recorded, and judged by a man who could have bought her entire village with a single gold coin. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the prep table until her knuckles turned stark white. She did not kneel, and she did not speak. She simply stayed in her corner, holding onto the wood that smelled of yeast and old salt, watching the king dismantle the corrupt hierarchy of Oakhaven from the center of her humble floor. She had survived by being invisible, by observing the cruelties of men without drawing their ire. Now the most dangerous man in the realm had seen her perfectly, and Willa had no idea what that meant for the life she had fought so bitterly to build. The air inside the bakery had grown so thin it felt like breathing shattered glass. Outside, The winter storm battered the wooden shutters, but within the walls of the hearthside, the absolute stillness carried a physical weight. Alden turned away from the local alpha, writhing on the floorboards, and locked his piercing grey gaze on the far corner by the ovens. Brahman stood entirely frozen against the masonry. The tax clerk's knuckles were bone-white, where he clutched a heavy, leather-bound volume to his chest, holding it up as if the thick parchment could somehow act as a shield against sovereign authority. Alden extended one hand across the flour-dusted counter. It was not a threat, but a geographic inevitability. The entire room immediately oriented around that outstretched palm. Brahman stumbled over the uneven planks. As he reached the counter, he fumbled blindly at his waist, attempting to unhook the brass inkwell tethered to his leather belt. His fingers shook with such violent tremors that the clasp slipped. The brass inkwell hit the floorboards with a sharp, hollow crack. Dark, metallic liquid splashed across the pale wood, bleeding rapidly into the spilled flour like a wound that refused to close. Willa stared at the black stain ruining the last traces of her morning labor. Even now, with a king standing in her shop, she caught herself calculating how many loaves that ruined sweep of flour could have baked. Poverty was a reflex. It did not pause for majesty. That spilled ink felt like the perfect summary of border life, illustrating the careless destruction of the working class by those who held the pens. Brahman staggered the last few inches and laid the extortion ledger flat against the scarred wooden counter. It hit the surface with a heavy thud, displacing a small cloud of white dust that hung in the freezing air. Alden stepped up to the workspace. Willa stayed rigidly in place on the opposite side of the counter, keeping her hands folded neatly beneath her apron. She was mere inches from him now. She could smell the crisp scent of frozen pine and cold iron coming off his wool tunic, completely masking the damp, unwashed odor he had worn only moments before. The rusted metal button she had refused to take as payment still sat exactly where he had left it, resting just inches from the edge of the corrupt tax book. He reached out and flipped the heavy leather cover open. The brass hinges groaned in protest. The thick parchment pages were completely filled with sharp, nervous handwriting. Endless columns of numbers stacked beside the names of the starving. It was not a record of administration. It was a meticulously organized catalogue of systemic theft. The sovereign traced a thick, calloused finger down the first column of the open ledger. The contrast was stark. Hands scarred by battle and hardened by extreme weather slid deliberately over the pristine, mathematical proof of bureaucratic cowardice. The widow Ilara, Alden read aloud, his voice a steady, resonant hum that vibrated against the cold stone of the hearth, assessed 3 copper coins for the winter hearth tax, paid in full. His finger dragging slowly across the rough parchment, and yet the sovereign decree abolished the winter hearth tax 4 years ago. By the doorway, Vance swallowed hard. The wet, desperate sound was entirely audible across the hushed room. The local alpha attempted to shift his weight off his bruised knees, but Captain Garrick took a single half-step forward. The subtle clink of military steel was enough. Vance froze in place, his performative arrogance completely stripped away. Alden turned a page. The dry rasp of the parchment sounded louder than a cracking whip. Tobias, the wheelwright. 4 measures of grain seized for border defense. Alden looked up, his pale eyes fixing on the trembling figure by the door. There has been no royal garrison on this border for a decade. Where did the grain go, Vance? The disgraced leader opened his mouth, looking like a cornered animal desperately searching for an exit that did not exist. The transport costs, Your Majesty. The roads are buried under thick ice, and the wagons require massive upkeep to navigate the drifts. Alden did not shout to cut him off. He simply returned his eyes to the book, dismissing the excuse as if it were a sudden draught of wind rattling the window panes. The Miller family, Alden continued. He spoke the name with slow, deliberate respect, pronouncing the titles of the forgotten peasantry, as if they were lords seated in the high court. Evicted, bakery seized, assets liquidated into the local administrative vault. Willa felt a sharp ache lodge itself between her ribs like a sliver of cold glass. He was reading the unvarnished history of Oakhaven's slow starvation. Every empty house, every cold hearth, every family that had packed their wagons in the dead of night and disappeared into the punishing snow were all here, reduced to neat rows of black ink on stolen parchment. She recognized every single name. She had sold bread to these people when they had coins, and given it away when they did not. Alden turned another page, then another, reading name after name into the freezing air. He did not rush the process. He forced every royal guard, the trembling clerk, and the kneeling alpha to listen to the exact accounting of their cruelty. He was exposing the mathematics of their greed, proving that true justice relied on concrete evidence rather than brute force. When he reached the final entry, Alden finally closed the ledger. The heavy thud of the cover echoed with absolute finality. He placed his scarred hand flat on the leather, his jaw set tightly. The audit was complete, and the undeniable truth was now a matter of public record. Alden closed the heavy leather ledger, the sound snapping like a dry twig in the absolute stillness of the bakery. The dust motes, dancing in the cold sunlight, seemed to freeze. He did not look at the corrupt local alpha groveling on the floorboards. He simply placed his gloved hand flat against the extortionate records. The fallen leader scrambled backward, his boots slipping on the thin layer of flour that dusted the wood. His arrogance had shattered, replaced by a frantic desperation. "You have no jurisdiction here," Vance spat, his voice cracking as he pointed a trembling finger toward the royal crest. "The borderlands fall under the blood treaties of the first winter. The local alpha holds supreme territorial right. You cannot strip my rank without a council of pack elders." Alden turned slowly. His movements were unhurried, terrifyingly calm. He occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. "The blood treaties," the Sovereign King said, his voice dropping into a low, quiet resonance that vibrated against the frozen window panes. Article 4, Section 2. A local alpha retains sovereignty only so long as the pack is fed, sheltered, and defended. You have starved them, Vance. You have built a hoard of copper on the backs of freezing commoners. The panicked man tried to stand, his chest heaving as he prepared to shift, to use the brute biological force that had bullied Oakhaven for years. Garrick Moss moved before the thought could fully form in his head. The Royal Guard captain stepped forward, his heavy iron boots completely silent until they struck the floorboards beside the fallen alpha. Garrick did not draw his sword. He simply placed a heavy, gauntleted hand on the man's shoulder, pressing him back down with the immovable weight of a stone monument. "The Crown's law supersedes all pack boundaries," Alden stated, his grey eyes fixing on the trembling man, "and the Crown finds you entirely insufficient." The air in the room grew cold with the undeniable reality of structural justice. This was not a brawl in the snow. This was the systematic dismantling of a tyrant. "Captain Moss," Alden said, his gaze returning to the ledger. "Sire," Garrick answered, his posture perfectly rigid. "Strip Vance Cross of his territorial insignia. Bind him in cold iron. He is to be transferred to the capital by nightfall to face a royal tribunal for systemic fraud, extortion, and the violation of the sovereign accords. It will be done." Garrick hauled him to his feet by the collar of his coat. He thrashed, shouting threats about ancient rights, but the royal guards flanking the door immediately stepped in. Cold iron chains rattled sharply. They bound the corrupt alpha's wrists, securing the locks with deliberate clicks. Willa watched from behind her counter. She kept her spine perfectly straight, her hands resting flat against the familiar grooves of the wood. She did not flinch when the guards dragged the prisoner past her. The local lord, who had threatened to throw her into the snow only moments ago, was now nothing more than a chained man, his authority stripped away by a single signature. Outside the bakery, the heavy winter wind carried the commotion into the village square. Drawn by the arrival of armoured royal carriages and the shouting of their former tormentor, the peasants of Oakhaven had begun to gather. They stood ankle-deep in the snow, shivering beneath thin cloaks, their faces drawn tight with exhausted curiosity. The sovereign king stepped through the open doorway, the northern frost immediately catching the silver threads of his royal uniform. Willa followed him as far as the threshold, her apron still dusted with barley flour. She stayed within the frame of her shop, observing the geometry of the crowd. The villagers recoiled slightly when the king appeared. They were accustomed to power arriving only to take something away. He did not raise his voice to a shout. He spoke with the measured clarity of a magistrate reading a final verdict, his words slicing easily through the whistling wind. The extortionate grain taxes levied by Vance Cross are hereby abolished, Alden announced, projecting the decree across the frozen square. The ledgers have been seized. Any debts recorded under his administration for the past 5 years are rendered legally void. You owe the estate nothing. A profound silence fell over the gathered peasants. They stared at the monarch, trying to process the magnitude of the structural shift. A woman in the front row, clutching a bundled infant to her chest, let out a ragged, disbelieving breath. Then a low murmur rippled through the crowd. The sound built slowly, transforming from hesitant whispers into a collective exhale of relief. They did not erupt into cinematic cheers. They were too cold, too battered by years of neglect. Instead, a few men removed their battered hats. Several older Omegas wept quietly, wrapping their arms around their own ribs. The response was a deeply practical gratitude. Alden turned away from the square and faced Willa. He stepped back inside, closing the physical distance between the highest authority in the realm and the poorest baker in the territory. As for this establishment, Alden said, ensuring his voice carried to the scribes waiting by the carriage. He looked directly into Willa's eyes. There was no mockery in his expression. There was only absolute respect. Your ledgers are clean. Your debts to the local estate are erased. Willa felt her knuckles whiten against the doorframe. The threat of eviction, the looming fear of starving in the snow, dissolved completely. Furthermore, Alden continued, pulling a heavy parchment scroll from the inner lining of his coat. He placed it on the counter, next to where the rusted button still rested. By royal decree, the Hearthside is hereby designated as the official royal provider of the Northern Realm. You will hold the exclusive contract to supply the border garrisons. The Crown will provision your grain, your wood, and your salt. Willa stared at the parchment. The royal seal was already pressed into the wax, bearing the mark of the sovereign wolf. It was not a gesture of pity. It was a formal, documented recognition of her competence and endurance. She looked up at the man who had worn rags only hours before. The beggar who silently accepted her bread had just given her a permanent sanctuary. "Thank you, Your Majesty," Willa said. Her voice did not waver. She stood tall in her empty bakery, accepting the justice she had earned. The square outside the bakery had become a theatre of iron and frost. The biting winter wind carried the rhythmic clanking of manacles drawn tight over wrists that had only known the comfort of stolen wealth. Garrick Moss stood near the center of the frozen mud, a rigid line of military discipline. He did not shout commands. The royal guards moved with the terrifying, silent precision of a machine that had operated across 100 territories, dismantling the corrupt infrastructure of Oakhaven piece by piece. Vance Cross was shoved forward. His expensive fur coat had been stripped away, leaving him in a thin linen tunic that offered no protection against the chill. He stumbled over a rut in the hardened earth, his knees scraping against the ice. No one stepped forward to help him up. The enforcers, who had flanked him for years, were currently being chained in a neat line near the prisoner transport wagon, their heads bowed beneath the unyielding gaze of the sovereign detachment. The fallen alpha pushed himself up, his breath plumbing in frantic bursts. He looked toward the perimeter of the square, seeking a sympathetic face among the crowd of peasants. The villagers stood, pressed shoulder to shoulder in the snow. Their expressions were entirely blank, a collective wall of hardened observation. Garrick adjusted his heavy leather gloves. He motioned with 2 fingers, signaling the guards to load the disgraced lord into the iron-barred carriage. Before Vance could take another step, a sudden movement broke the stillness of the crowd. A small boy, wearing a patched wool tunic too thin for the season, stepped past the line of adults. He bent down, scraping his raw fingers against the frozen earth, and unearthed a hard clod of icy dirt. With a sharp practiced swing of his arm, the child threw it. The frozen mud struck Vance squarely between the shoulder blades. It shattered against the linen, leaving a spray of dark soil across his back. The former alpha spun around, his jaw snapping open to deliver a threat. He froze. Garrick had not drawn a weapon, but the captain had shifted his weight slightly, a silent promise of absolute ruin if the prisoner took a single aggressive step. The Sovereign Guards, flanking the carriage, held their positions rigidly, waiting for an excuse. Vance swallowed the threat, his shoulders collapsing inward. He turned away, dragging his chained boots up the wooden ramp into the iron cage. Garrick did not reprimand the child. He merely offered a brief nod toward the boy's mother, who gently pulled her son back into the safety of the crowd. The heavy iron door of the transport slammed shut, the sound echoing sharply off the stone walls. The lock engaged with a decisive click. The reign of terror in Oakhaven had ended not with a bloody battle, but with the systematic application of sovereign law and a handful of frozen dirt. The atmosphere within the shop remained thick, with the scent of old pine and lingering frost. Willa stood near her counter, her hands resting flat against the scarred wood. The silence of her shop felt heavier now, an empty vessel waiting to be filled. The low rumble of iron-rimmed wheels approaching her door broke the quiet. The sound was too heavy for a typical merchant cart, accompanied by the steady cadence of armored boots crunching through the packed snow. A shadow fell over the front window, blocking the grey afternoon light. The bell above the door chimed softly. Garrick ducked beneath the low lintel, bringing the crisp scent of cold iron with him. He did not step fully into the middle of the bakery, choosing instead to remain near the threshold, a deliberate gesture to respect the boundaries of her space. He turned his head toward the open doorway and gave a short, sharp gesture. 4 royal guards entered in a single-file line. They carried massive woven burlap sacks, their shoulders braced against the immense weight. The first guard set his burden gently against the far wall, untying the thick hemp rope. The second placed a heavy wooden crate lined with beeswax cloth onto the floor. The third and fourth carried thick cuts of premium seasoned firewood, split cedar and dense oak, radiating the sharp, clean fragrance of the deep northern forests. They worked in absolute silence, moving back and forth from the carriage until the empty corners of the bakery were stacked high with provisions. Willa watched the transformation of her meager space, her posture entirely still, though her pulse drummed a frantic rhythm against her ribs. When the final crate was set down, Garrick bowed his head slightly. He did not offer a grand speech or a demand for gratitude. He simply stepped back out into the snow, leaving her alone with the staggering reality of the delivery. Willa walked slowly toward the nearest sack. She untied the remaining loop of rope and pulled back the rough fabric. Inside, the grain was abundant. She reached out, sinking her cracked, flour-dusted fingers deep into the sack. The grain felt strangely warm against her skin, heavy and substantial. She closed her eyes, running her thumb over the soft powder, letting the tactile sensation anchor her to the present moment. Her breath hitched, catching sharply in the back of her throat. She had spent enough of her life learning not to cry in front of people who would not understand why. But as she inhaled the rich scent of the yeast and the sharp pine of the fresh firewood, The constant, suffocating pressure in her chest slowly uncoiled. She would not have to count copper coins in the dark tonight. She would not have to ration her salt or worry if the embers would last until dawn. The floor was full. The hearth would burn with sovereign cedar. The bakery settled into an insulated quiet, thick with the scent of the newly delivered milled wheat and fresh pine logs. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the shop, the temperature was steadily rising, thanks to the roaring fire the royal guards had built before retreating to the perimeter. Suddenly, the oak door unlatched with a soft click. Willa turned, her hand instinctively dropping toward the small paring knife beneath the counter. Old survival habits did not vanish, simply because the immediate threat of eviction had passed. Alden stepped into the shop, closing the door to block the winter draft. He was alone. He had shed the heavy sovereign cloak, wearing only a tailored midnight blue tunic and dark trousers that emphasized the broad, imposing line of his shoulders. Without the imposing layers of royal authority, he looked leaner, but the sheer density of his physical presence remained unchanged. He did not move like a monarch expecting fanfare. He moved with the careful steps of a man who knew how to navigate fragile spaces without breaking the objects within them. He crossed the room, the floorboards creaking faintly beneath his boots. The scent of ozone and cold iron accompanied him, overriding the warm smell of the yeast. Willa did not bow. She simply watched him approach, her breath catching slightly as he stopped on the opposite side of the counter. His gaze was fixed on her face, analyzing her reaction with the same quiet intensity he had used when sitting in the corner as a beggar. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his tunic. His movements were slow, deliberate, ensuring she tracked every shifting muscle. He withdrew his hand and lowered it to the wooden surface between them. He opened his fingers. Resting on the scarred wood was the rusted metal button. Alden placed his large, scarred hand flat on the counter next to it. The knuckles were still cracked from the freezing snow, the skin split and healing. It was the hand of a beggar, attached to the wrist of a ruler. "I offered this to you earlier," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly current. "You refused it. You gave me your last resource, expecting nothing in return. A sovereign does not leave debts unpaid. This button is no longer a plea for charity. It is a marker of what I owe you." He left his hand resting on the wood, making no sudden moves. He was waiting, not for obedience, but for her judgment. Willa looked from the rusted token to the deep scars crisscrossing the back of his hand. She did not reach out to take the metal piece. Instead, she turned back to the ceramic bowl resting beside the flour bin. She picked up her heavy wooden stirring paddle, her fingers wrapping tightly around the familiar, worn handle. She set the paddle down on the edge of the flour bin with a sharp, firm click. The sound snapped through the heavy air, drawing his unwavering gaze. "You tested this territory," she said. Her voice was steady, lacking any tremor of intimidation. "You disguised yourself to root out the extortion in the local administration. I understand the strategy. I understand the necessity of a king seeing the truth with his own eyes." She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron, lifting her chin to meet his stare. "But I am not a pack elder, nor am I a council member. I am a baker. When you sat by my fire, you were not evaluating my loyalty to the crown. You were testing my survival." Alden stayed utterly unmoving. He did not interrupt her, nor did he pull his royal rank to demand silence. The entire room seemed to orient toward his stillness, but Willa refused to look away. "That loaf of barley bread was the last of my provisions," she continued, letting the exhaustion she had suppressed all day finally bleed into her tone. Not the erratic heat of a panicked victim, but the cold, measured certainty of a woman who had worked too hard to be treated as a variable in a political experiment. "If the tax collector had not arrived, if you had simply walked out into the snow with my food, I would have starved by the end of the week. You asked me to wager my life without telling me the stakes. You proved that the local administrator was a thief, but you also proved that a sovereign can be careless with the people he claims to protect." The king absorbed the statement. For a lesser man, such a direct challenge from a common baker would have resulted in immediate imprisonment. Alden did not flinch, his jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his skin. He leaned slightly forward, resting his weight on his palms against the counter. He was towering over her, yet his posture was deeply unthreatening. It was an absolute acknowledgement of fault. "You are right," Alden answered, the rough edge of his tone softening into something dangerously sincere. "It was a tactical calculation. I looked at a broken village and saw a system to fix, forgetting that the people inside it were already bleeding. I put you in danger to prove a point." He slowly dragged the rusted button across the wood until it rested directly in front of her. "I am not asking for absolution. I am asking you to hold me to a higher standard than the men who ruled here before. Keep the marker. Use it when I fail." Willa looked down at the small piece of metal, then back up at the man standing before her. For the first time since dawn, the tight, defensive coil in her chest began to unwind. She did not smile, but the hard line of her shoulders finally dropped. "I will hold you to it," she said quietly. The dawn light, filtering through the frosted windows, carried an entirely different hue this morning. It was not the bleak, suffocating grey of impending eviction, but the crisp, pale silver of an honest northern winter. Willa stood at the heavy oak prep table, her sleeves rolled past her elbows. The royal wheat flour required a different rhythm than the coarse barley grit she was used to fighting. This powder was silken, absorbing the warm water and fresh yeast with a smooth, effortless elasticity. She pressed the heels of her hands into the dough, leaning her weight into the motion. The physical labor grounded her, pushing the overwhelming political shifts of the previous day into the background. She folded fresh rosemary sprigs and coarse sea salt into the mass, letting the sharp, resinous aroma mix with the deep, earthy scent of activating yeast. The stone oven behind her radiated a massive, steady heat, fueled by the premium cedar logs the royal guards had stacked against the eastern wall. For the first time in years, the young baker did not have to count the remaining embers or calculate the precise lifespan of a dying fire. She could simply focus on her craft. As the first batch of heavy loaves hit the baking stones, the rich, complex fragrance of blooming bread pushed through the drafty cracks of the window frames. It drifted out into the freezing village square, acting as a beacon in the bitter wind. By mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered outside the hearthside. Willa wiped her hands on her linen apron and looked through the glass. The villagers of Oakhaven stood ankle-deep in the packed snow. They shifted their weight awkwardly, pulling their threadbare cloaks tighter around their narrow shoulders. These were the same merchants and labourers who had turned their backs on her at the market yesterday, paralyzed by the systemic fear of Vance Cross. Now, with the corrupt administrator chained and gone, they carried the heavy, suffocating weight of collective guilt. No one knocked on her door. No one reached for the iron bell above the entrance. They simply stood in the freezing gale, staring at the warm light spilling from her windows, entirely convinced they no longer possessed the right to cross her newly elevated threshold. Willa understood the mechanics of fear perfectly. She knew that desperate poverty made cowards of good people, and she refused to let the rot of the old regime infect the new day. True sovereignty was not about holding grudges against the powerless. She reached for a large woven basket, the same one that had carried her meager firewood, and lined it with clean linen. She filled it to the brim with hot, fresh rolls, their crusts dark and dusted with white flour. Walking to the front of the shop, she unlatched the sturdy front entrance and pulled it wide open. The winter wind bit immediately at her cheeks, but the massive heat of the royal oven rushed out behind her, washing over the front row of the crowd. She stepped onto the threshold. She did not offer a grand, theatrical speech about forgiveness or community healing. She simply held out the heavy basket, The old woodcutter, Taurus, was the first to step forward. He took a warm roll, his rough, scarred hands trembling slightly against the crust, and offered a low, stiff nod of profound gratitude. One by one, the village stepped out of the cold, the fracture in their community quietly sealing over a shared meal. Hours later, the frantic energy of the day had finally burned down to a quiet, steady ember. The display cases were empty again, not from starvation this time, but from overwhelming demand. Willa turned the iron key in the lock, securing the heavy door against the descending night. The bakery was silent, save for the rhythmic crackle of the cedar logs, settling deep in the masonry. She walked back toward the hearth, her boots moving slowly across the swept floorboards. Alden was still there. He had not returned to the lavish royal pavilion set up by his guards on the edge of the pine woods. He occupied the heavy wooden chair tucked beneath her cutting table, the exact seat she had dragged across the room for a freezing beggar only hours earlier. He had removed his heavy military cloak, leaving only the dark velvet tunic that marked his supreme rank, but he looked entirely anchored in the flour-dusted room. His presence did not shrink the space, it merely made the walls feel impenetrable. Willa picked up a thick linen cloth and reached into the back of the oven. She pulled out the final loaf of the day. It was a dense, hearty barley bread, identical to the recipe she had surrendered when she thought she had nothing left to her name. She carried the hot loaf to the small wooden stool beside his chair and set it down. Alden did not look at the silver royal crest gleaming on his own hand. He looked at the baker. Slowly, he reached out with his bare, calloused fingers. The crust was blisteringly hot, but the king did not flinch. He gripped the edges of the bread and pulled. The loaf fractured with a sharp, satisfying crack, releasing a thick plume of fragrant steam into the air between them. Alden looked down at the uneven halves. With a slow, deliberate motion, he extended his arm, offering her the larger portion. It was a quiet, physical reversal of the sacrifice she had made for him, executing a promise of mutual care without demanding a single word in return. Willa took the warm bread. The crust was rough against her palms, anchoring her to the undeniable reality of her own survival. She sat on the opposite edge of the raised hearth, pulling her knees up slightly to preserve the warmth. "The capital is a month's ride through the mountains," she said softly, watching the firelight dance across his severe, scarred features. "The High Council will expect their king to return before the deep snows block the pass." Alden took a slow bite of his bread, the rigid, authoritative line of his jaw relaxing into something approaching genuine peace. "The council can manage the capital," the sovereign answered, his voice a low, steady rumble that filled the quiet room perfectly. "The structural integrity of this border requires a permanent overseer. The ledgers must be rebuilt, and the supply lines secured. I intend to spend the winter right here, ensuring the foundation holds." He met her gaze, his grey eyes offering a deep, unconditional respect that required absolutely no performance or rank to maintain. If the royal provider permits it. Willa looked at the intense warmth radiating from her oven, at the secure, unbreachable walls of her home, and finally at the powerful man who had traded his crown for a rusted button just to find her. She took a bite of the barley bread, letting the rich, complex taste of permanent safety settle deep in her chest. "She permits it," Willa answered quietly, the winter storm raging harmlessly outside their door.